Your best employee did not quit because of a bad raise. She quit because someone worse got paid more. That's equity theory, developed by psychologist John Stacey Adams back in 1963. And it explains something managers routinely get backwards when someone unexpectedly walks out the door. People do not judge pay by the number sitting on their own check in isolation. They judge it by comparing their own effort and reward against someone else's effort and reward, forming a ratio. And if that ratio feels unfair relative to a peer, motivation collapses, regardless of what the absolute number actually is. Adams called this inequity distress. And it hits high performers hardest of anyone, precisely because they're the ones most capable of noticing the gap fastest. A mediocre performer might not track exactly what a colleague is earning relative to output. A top performer almost always does, consciously or not, because comparison is baked into how they evaluate whether their own effort is being recognized fairly. Here's the twist most people miss entirely. Overpayment causes problems too, just a quieter, less destructive kind. Employees who come to believe they're earning more than they deserve relative to peers often work harder for a while, almost unconsciously, just to justify the gap to themselves. But underpayment triggers something sharper and more corrosive. People experiencing it do not simply work less across the board in an obvious, visible way. They quietly redefine what counts as fair effort going forward, cutting corners nobody notices immediately. Skipping the extra tasks that used to be automatic, disengaging from anything above the bare minimum required to keep the job. It is a slow renegotiation happening entirely inside one person's head, with no memo, no conversation, no formal announcement. A well-known study tested exactly this, paying two groups unequally for completing the identical task. The underpaid group produced measurably less, and critically, not out of laziness or spite in any deliberate sense. They produced less to restore balance in their own internal accounting of what fair effort looked like, given what they now believed they were being paid relative to someone else doing the same work. The unsettling part for managers, the part that makes this genuinely hard to manage around, is that the comparison driving all of this does not need to be accurate to have real effects. An employee only needs to believe a peer earns more for the exact same effort, and motivation drops, even if that belief turns out to be flat wrong. Perception runs the formula, not verified fact. Let's break this down through three different lenses, because each one reveals a different piece of why this mechanism runs so deep and spreads so easily inside real teams. At the individual psychology level, humans are wired to use social comparison as their primary tool for judging fairness, far more than they use any absolute internal standard. This isn't a character flaw specific to certain employees. It's close to a universal feature of how people evaluate their own situation, going back to well before anyone studied it formally in an office setting. Telling someone just focus on your own numbers, don't worry about what anyone else makes, runs directly against how human judgment actually works, and it rarely succeeds as advice, no matter how reasonable it sounds when a manager says it out loud. At the team dynamics level, one perceived unfair gap doesn't stay contained to the two people directly involved. It becomes a story that circulates, sometimes accurately, often distorted with each retelling, and it recalibrates how an entire team privately estimates whether the whole compensation system can be trusted. One employee's quiet disengagement, invisible on its own, can seed a slow erosion across several people who never even had the original conversation, because they heard a version of it secondhand and updated their own internal fairness calculation accordingly. At the organizational incentive structure level, secrecy around pay interacts with this mechanism in a specifically damaging way. Secrecy does not prevent comparison from happening. It simply removes accurate information from the comparison, forcing employees to estimate what their peers earn using whatever fragments of information happen to leak through. Casual comments, guesses based on someone's lifestyle, assumptions based on tenure or title. Silence gets filled with assumptions, and those assumptions skew pessimistic almost every time, because people tend to assume the gap works against them rather than in their favor when they don't actually know. Transparent, explainable pay structures reduce inequity distress meaningfully, even when the actual underlying numbers stay exactly the same as they were under a secretive system, purely because the guessing stops. Now picture a second, smaller version of this, playing out somewhere far from a big corporate pay scandal. Two customer support agents on the same small team. Similar tenure, similar performance reviews. One picks up a side project that happens to catch a director's attention and gets a modest spot bonus for it, publicly announced in a team meeting as encouragement for others to step up. The other agent, doing equally solid work on the core job that nobody happened to notice that quarter, doesn't get anything. Nothing about that second agent's actual pay changed. But their perceived ratio of effort to reward, relative to their teammate, just shifted, and over the following weeks they start declining extra requests they would have said yes to without hesitation a month earlier. No resignation, no complaint filed, just a quiet redefinition of where the line sits. It's worth digging into why underpayment and overpayment produce such different behavioral responses, because the asymmetry itself is the most useful part of this theory for a manager to actually understand. When someone believes they're overpaid relative to a peer, the discomfort that creates is mild and easily resolved just by working a bit harder for a while. A small, low-cost adjustment that restores the sense of balance without much friction. But when someone believes they're underpaid relative to a peer, the discomfort is sharper because the obvious fix, working harder to close the gap, doesn't actually solve anything from their perspective. Working harder while underpaid just deepens the unfairness they're already experiencing. So instead, the mind reaches for the other lever available, lowering effort to match the lower reward, which restores the ratio from the opposite direction. This is why underpayment tends to produce quiet disengagement rather than loud complaints. Complaining requires confronting the situation directly, which carries its own social risk. Quietly doing less requires nothing except a private decision nobody else needs to approve. There's also a timing dimension to this worth naming, because inequity distress doesn't always appear immediately after the triggering event. Sometimes an employee learns about a colleague's higher pay and reacts within days. But often the information arrives gradually, a comment here, an assumption there, slowly hardening into a belief over weeks or months before it ever visibly changes behavior. This delay is exactly why so many managers are caught off guard when a strong performer suddenly resigns out of nowhere. From the manager's side, nothing changed recently. From the employee's side, a slow recalibration had been running quietly in the background for a long time, and the resignation is simply the moment that internal process finally reached its conclusion. Consider a different scenario to see this pattern from another direction. Two project managers on the same team are given the same title, similar tenure, similar workload. One negotiated a modestly higher starting salary years ago during a tight hiring market, an entirely reasonable, defensible, historical reason that has nothing to do with current performance. The other project manager eventually finds this out, perhaps through a shared spreadsheet accidentally left open or an offhand remark. The gap in this case is small, genuinely minor in dollar terms, and fully explainable by market conditions at the time of hire. But without that explanation ever being offered, the discovering employee doesn't fill in the reasonable historical context on their own. They fill in the gap with the least favorable available explanation, that their own work is somehow valued less, and their engagement quietly drops over the following months, disproportionate to how small the actual pay difference really was. There's an important nuance here worth being careful about, because this concept gets misapplied in a specific, common way. The lesson is not, pay must always be perfectly identical for anyone in a similar role, because legitimate differences exist. Different experience levels, different scope of responsibility, different market conditions when someone was hired. Trying to flatten every gap into artificial sameness creates its own problems and can actually punish genuinely higher performers by refusing to recognize real differences in contribution. The actual fix isn't equal numbers, it's an explainable ratio. Employees can generally accept a real difference if the reasoning behind it is visible and makes sense to them. What breaks trust isn't the existence of a gap. It's a gap nobody can explain, sitting inside a silence that lets the worst-case assumption fill the space. The real takeaway for managers sits in that last point. One raise never stays private in its actual effect, no matter how quietly it gets processed through payroll. It resets everyone else's internal fairness calculation the moment they become aware of it, whether that happens through an official announcement or a hallway rumor 3 weeks later. Explain the reasoning behind pay decisions before employees are left to guess it themselves. because the guess almost always assumes something worse than the truth. And by the time you find out someone's been quietly recalibrating their own effort for months, the actual damage is already sitting in last quarter's output, not this week's conversation. There's a broader pattern worth naming here about why pay secrecy became the default norm at so many companies in the first place. Despite how poorly it holds up once you understand equity theory, secrecy is usually adopted for reasons that have nothing to do with employee psychology at all. It's meant to give managers negotiating flexibility, to avoid awkward conversations, or simply because it's always been done that way and nobody questioned it. Almost no company sits down, understands the underlying mechanism of inequity distress, and then deliberately chooses secrecy anyway as the better option. It persists mostly through inertia, not through any genuine analysis of what it does to motivation. Once you see the mechanism clearly, the trade-off looks different. Secrecy protects a handful of individual negotiations at the cost of degrading trust across the entire team. Continuously, in the background, whether or not anyone ever files a complaint about it. One more distinction worth making explicit here too. Equity theory is about relative comparison, not absolute satisfaction. And that difference explains why even genuinely generous compensation can still fail to retain someone. A company can pay well above market rate for a role and still lose that employee if the person sitting next to them, doing visibly less, somehow ends up perceived as earning even more. The absolute number was never the variable driving the decision to leave. The ratio was. This is uncomfortable for managers to internalize, because it means generosity alone, without attention to relative fairness across a team, doesn't buy the loyalty it's often assumed to buy. It's also worth being precise about what explainable actually means in practice, because vague reassurance doesn't do the job equity theory suggests is needed. Telling an employee pay decisions are based on a lot of factors, when they ask why a peer earns more, doesn't resolve inequity distress. It often deepens it, because it sounds like a dismissal rather than an actual answer. What resolves it is a specific, honest explanation tied to something concrete, whether that's a difference in scope of responsibility, time in the role, market conditions when someone was hired, or a documented performance distinction. The explanation doesn't need to satisfy the employee completely or make them happy about the gap. It needs to replace an assumption with a fact, because the whole mechanism runs on unfilled gaps getting filled with the worst available guess. A concrete answer, even one that isn't the answer someone wanted to hear, still shuts down the guessing. And shutting down the guessing is most of what actually protects motivation here. Worth closing on one more practical distinction: a manager cannot control every comparison an employee makes, including comparisons to people outside the company entirely, a friend's salary at another firm, an industry benchmark seen online. What a manager can control is whether the comparisons happening inside their own team are backed by real information or by guesswork. That's a narrower, more achievable target than trying to make everyone feel perfectly satisfied with their pay in some absolute sense. And it's the one equity theory actually gives a manager real leverage over. It's also worth thinking about the manager's own blind spot in all of this, because equity judgments aren't only something employees make about each other, managers make them too, often without noticing. A manager who privately believes one report is simply more talented than another will unconsciously start justifying pay gaps to themselves using effort and output language, even when the actual difference is smaller than it feels. That internal justification matters because it shapes how convincingly the manager can explain a pay decision later, and an explanation that was built to satisfy the manager's own conscience often falls apart the moment an employee asks a direct, specific question about it. Worth adding one more real-world texture to this about how equity comparisons shift depending on who's actually visible to whom. A remote employee often has a narrower reference group than someone sitting in a busy open office, simply because they see fewer people's day-to-day effort up close, which means their sense of what's fair gets shaped disproportionately by whatever pay or recognition information does reach them. Rumor, a LinkedIn post, an offhand comment in a meeting. This is part of why equity distress can spike unpredictably in hybrid teams. The comparison set isn't stable, and a manager who assumes fairness perceptions are evenly distributed across a team is usually wrong in ways that are hard to see from the outside. I want to hear from you on this one. Has your team ever seen a good employee quietly check out after noticing someone else got paid more for less? Subscribe if you want more of these workplace psychology breakdowns explained the same practical way, one real mechanism at a time.